Russian tactical nuclear weapons, for instance. Their CONOPs are really based in the 70s and 80s. As it is now, means that the Russians can barely, light up a launcher with its tactical nuclear weapons without us knowing about it.
The NATO generals, admirals, air marshals all say with enormous confidence, no, NATO would fight this war in an entirely different way.
Drones don't allow you to have fewer people on the battlefield because somebody's got to control the drone.
Since Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, we've seen the resurgence of the tank and Russian battle strategy mirroring that of World War I. But we've also seen this war play out very much in the 21st century, with Ukraine deploying the use of drones, artificial intelligence, and robots to launch their counter-offensives against Russian forces. When Iran attacked Israel earlier this year, the Royal Air Force shot down a number of drones, and there's new evidence to suggest that Iranian and Emirati drones have been used in the war in Sudan. But what weapons will we see global superpowers and other smaller players employ in the next conflict? And how can we try and regulate these new technologies? Today, I'm joined by defence analyst Michael Clarke and former British Army Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon to try and answer these questions. So how have we seen the war landscape change in Ukraine? Michael, I'll come to you first. There's always this danger, I think, that people rush to learn the lessons of the last war and prepare their force for the next war based on that. So in your opinion, to what degree have we seen a complete transformation of the way that wars are fought through the way that it's been fought in Ukraine? Or are we seeing just the consequence of the way the Russians and the Ukrainians fight, and NATO and others may still choose to do it if differently?
No, I think you're absolutely right, James. We're seeing a bit of everything in the war in Ukraine. We're seeing the top and bottom of it. The top of it in the highest sort of technology and the use of space and SpaceX satellites, which are really important to what's going on the ground, right down to the tanks and the armored vehicles and the trench warfare. A lot of Ukrainian soldiers have had to learn the lessons of our grandfathers and great-grandfathers in avoiding trench foot and keeping your feet clean. Any infantryman knows, as you do, that you've got to look after your feet and so on. So we've seen all of that. And in a way, I mean, we are seeing a distinctively Russian-Ukrainian conflict, but we're also seeing lots of pointers to what conflict is going to become. The way in which I think this war is most traditional is not so much in the technologies, but because this war represents the return of industrial age warfare to Europe. We thought we wouldn't see it again, certainly not in our lifetimes, although I've always thought it would come back eventually. But here we are in the earlier part of the 21st century, seeing industrial age warfare, which means that the side which will prevail in Ukraine is that which can gear up its economy and deploy all of its economic power to the front line in ways that make a strategic difference. Now, the Russians are already doing that. The Ukrainians are trying to do it, but will only succeed if we in the West are prepared to do it as well, to a quite considerable extent. So in that respect, this war is a very 20th century style war, industrial age warfare, but of course it's going to be played out with lots of the weapons and the technologies of the 21st century that you pointed to in your introduction.
Well, Hamish, you're a former tank commander. I have to be honest, in the first few weeks of the war, when Russian armoured columns were halted by small bands of determined people running out of woodblocks with shoulder-launched missiles, I was sort of much happier in my heritage as a light infantryman and wouldn't have wanted to be in a tank for love nor money. But it feels to me like once we've got beyond that initial phase of the war and it's moved out of the urban environment of the outskirts of Kyiv, we have seen that those industrial age technologies that Michael just spoke about are indeed still as relevant now as they would have been in the 80s.
Yes, no, absolutely. In fact, I'm just writing a piece at the moment for another publication called "The Tank is Dead, Long Live the Tank." But I absolutely agree with Michael's assertion that we now have a balance of mass and technology. I think in the West, we've been slightly seduced that technology is the answer. But actually, what we're seeing is that we mustn't forget about mass, whether it's massive manpower, massive tanks, massive drones. And I'm sure that we will come on to the drones. But the tank itself, the effectiveness it had in the first great tank battles at Combray on the 20th of November 1917, actually, we are seeing exactly the same sort of battles happening in the Donbass and Bakhmut. And when we look at the technology side of it, we've perhaps, the great Tiger tank of the Second World War, everybody, the Germans thought it was the answer, but actually it was a really good tank. It was a bit too overcomplicated and unreliable. And it was overwhelmed. The Germans only managed to make about 1,500 Tiger ones. The Germans produced 49,000, the Americans produced 49,000 Shermans. And we're sort of seeing the same sort of thing play out on the battlefields in eastern Ukraine. Yeah, sure, Challenger 2 and Leopard 2 are great tanks, are very sophisticated. But in onesies and twosies against hundreds of old Soviet tanks, it's getting overwhelmed. So I think, it's really, all's changed and nothing's new. And I think just to finish up here, the principles of air power, land power and maritime power are absolutely crucial to this. It strikes me that he who rules the skies, or he who wins the drone battles, is probably going to win the war.
So that, I think, is the key point. The Russians pressed on with their invasion without achieving air superiority. And I think that will ultimately be proven as the reason that they failed in their timeline that they had originally set out. What we've got now is that both sides have, to a degree, access to the air. Drones are everywhere. That makes surveillance of the battlefield almost entire. And therefore, it becomes really hard to hide. Now, I want to come to drones later on, but as a minister thinking about this stuff, the thing that I found hardest to square is I agree with you both that those industrial age technologies, the tank, the armored fighting vehicle, the frigate, the destroyer, the combat fast aircraft, are all part of the modern force. But the bigger and better the missile technology becomes, the more that you have to armor them. So the bigger the power pack they need, the bigger the tonnage that they are, the more that you want them to be able to operate all sorts of modern, novel weapon systems and be part of an integrated network of systems on the battle space. The more power they need, the bigger size they are. So you end up in a situation where you're being asked by the Army, Navy, Air Force to buy ever more exquisite, ever bigger platforms. And that feels completely at odds with the miniaturization and the dispersal of the force that would make sense in an environment that is so heavily surveilled. So, Michael, I'll come to you first, because I know that you and your team at RUSI have been thinking a lot about this. How do we square that requirement for the industrial age technologies, making them survivable, whilst at the same time taking advantage of all the opportunities of automation, AI, and the necessity to disperse?
Yeah, and of course, as a minister, James, you're required to find the sort of philosopher's stone. You're required to find this sort of. We talk about exquisite technologies. You're required to find an exquisite balance between what the services want, which of course is more of everything. They're naturally programmed to want that, and very sophisticated technologies, particularly in air power. They say, there are no prizes coming second in air power in particular. You can't recover from a defeat very easily in air power, whereas you might be able to recover a bit more quickly in land power and so on. They make those arguments, and those are sensible arguments, but you can't then just have airframes or main platforms without all the things that go with it and without exploring the new technologies. And so the trick, which is what the services are trying to come up with now, is to work out where the significant areas of breakthrough are likely to occur. So we all know it's something to do with robotics. We all understand that. Drones are robotics, the Tempest program, the new GCAP and so on, the new air superiority ideas for the Navy, again, to have robotic ships. We all know that's the future for sixth generation weapons. The question is, where would robotics make the biggest difference? And is there a way in which robotics actually allow you to concentrate your energies elsewhere. At the moment, that isn't true. Because we talk about drones, but I mean drones don't allow you to have fewer people on the battlefield because somebody's got to control the drones. But this is where I think we are on the edge of a real military revolution. When drones become really linked to AI, then with large areas, they will become effectively autonomous weapon systems. And one person may be the human in the loop who is looking after 1,000 drones, 10,000 drones. The area below 5,000 feet could be an autonomous battlefield area with one person or a small team of people responsible for it. But the drones working with AI will work out their own strategies, they'll work out their own targets, and they will attack them. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but we are not far away from that revolution. And in a sense, your job as a minister is to try to navigate the areas where would that sort of thing, I'm giving you one, I think, big example, AI and drones, where would that make the most difference? And where can then you put scarce resources to develop that and be ahead of the game in trying to work that through? And Britain has made sincere efforts to do that on the basis of a constrained budget. I mean, intellectually, I've always thought Britain is pretty good at making these judgments. The problem is, can we follow it up with enough investment to actually bring it to fruition in time? The answer to that is not quite, but nevertheless, we're pretty good on the scientific side and the technological side of all of that.
So, Hamish, like most Western militaries, we're in the process of recapitalising our army here in the UK. And that recapitalisation really looks like the army of the 1990s, just with more sophisticated platforms, but fundamentally it's the same force design. Is there a danger that by the time Challenger 3, the British new main battle tank, and Boxer, the armoured fighting vehicle, are in service, mid-2030s, that the nature of the land warfare will have changed so fundamentally that we've recapitalised and bought an entirely obsolete force design?
That's a great question. I mean, yes and no. I mean, you really put your finger on the big challenge of military procurement that you'll know better than all of us, of course, that because it takes so long, things will be out of date. I mean, I look at the Port and Dan have developed this laser for knocking down drones called Dragonfire. But we understand it's not going to be in place for sort of another 4 years. If it was in place today, absolutely it would be game changing. So they're in the challenge. I think really at the root of it, of what we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment, is what we call concept of operations, how you actually use the stuff. And that is failing, I think, to keep up with technology. When we look at an area that I've expert in and written a lot about is, Russian tactical nuclear weapons, for instance. Their CONOPS are really based in the 70s and 80s when intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition was as it was then. As it is now means that, the Russians can barely, light up a launcher with its tactical nuclear weapons without us knowing about it virtually before the launcher operators themselves. So I think that is a really key element. The other element that that Mike alluded to, one of the challenges in this sort of as technology goes forward, we know that the key to being successful in land operations is combined arms maneuver with the support of the air and elsewhere. But that takes a heck of a lot of training. And I think one thing that you and your successors need to think about, going back to your original question, is are we going to have the right army in future? Is, are we going to be able to have the sort of follow-on echelons that are trained to conduct the warfare that we want? If we look at Ukraine at the moment, we know that the Russian professional army was killed or wiped out in the first year of the battle. To a degree, the same with the Ukrainians. What we're seeing now on the front line is very inexperienced Russian conscripts who can do little more than sort of get out of the trench and charge the enemy. And that might well be the same, for the Ukrainians too. And for ourselves, the size our army is at the moment, if we did get involved in a land war in Europe again, we must accept that our first echelon will last weeks, maybe months. But what about the follow-on? The war that Michael and you and I are talking about now is not something you can learn off the back of a fag packet in half an hour or so. So your question, will Ajax and Boxer be right in 10 years' time? I am sure they will. It'll be the concept of operations. And going back to my own area, tanks. Tanks are over 100 years old now, and still going strong. They haven't fundamentally changed. They're still a metal box with a gun and tracks. So I think it's all about how you use them, and technology must be balanced about people being able to exploit it to its degree. But I go back to my original comment. At the end of the day, you still do need that mass to be able to prevail.
So I think that
both sides are working with the second echelon forces now, aren't they? In Ukraine, both sides are fighting with the second echelon forces, and it goes back to the old idea that I think Patrick Sanders, the present CGS of the chief of the army, who's stepping down now, he always makes the point. He said that wars are started by professional armies and they're finished by citizen armies, whether it's conscript or a recruited army, a professional army who is volunteers. Eventually, big wars are finished by citizen armies. Professionals start them, citizens finish them, because that's the nature of warfare. Anything other than expeditionary operations, of which we've conducted for the last 30 odd years, are different. But a war where somebody has to prevail and some sort of national mobilization has to take place have to be finished by second or even third echelon forces.
Look, you're both entirely right about the requirement of generating follow-on forces. It leads me to want to ask you two questions, actually. The first is, when you talk to NATO senior generals, admirals, air marshals, they will tell you, when you say, well, is the war in Ukraine how a NATO war with Russia would translate? Does it just come down ultimately to both sides' ability to absorb a body count, an attritional battle? And the NATO generals, admirals, air marshals all say with enormous confidence, no. NATO would fight this war in an entirely different way. Now, I can see how a first echelon force would fight in an entirely different way, a force that is trained in peacetime over decades and is equipped with the most sophisticated things that you're able to buy very deliberately when supply chains are unconstrained. But once that first echelon fight is over, if not decisive, does even NATO come back to that attritional, just who can keep it going longest fight that we're seeing between the Ukrainians and the Russians now? I'll come Michael first.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, James. That the answer is that your follow-on forces, your second echelon, have got to be sufficiently trained reservists that they can pick up the combined arms requirements that Hamish is talking about as it were naturally. If they can't do that, and at the moment it's NATO forces don't have the sort of reserves that could really provide ready second echelon forces, then of course you're in a problem. When your first echelon forces are exhausted or can't do any more, if you can't follow on with second echelon forces who can take up the baton in the same way, then you've got a problem. And of course, that's exactly what happened in the Second World War. The first echelon forces were exhausted and finished by the end of 1940. The second echelon forces, the conscript army that then came together, was not very good until 1943-44. It wasn't ready until then. And that's why I often say 1942 was a dreadful year in the Second World War. And we're in that 1942 year now in Ukraine, that in fact, politically, the balance of forces moved significantly against the Axis powers in 1941. But it wasn't felt until the end of 1942. And so although it was clear that the Allies would win the war eventually, by December 1941, once America came into the war and Russia would change sides and was fighting Germany, that meant that the Germans were always going to lose, the Japanese were always going to lose. But 1942 was a dreadful year because that was the era in which the follow-on forces were not ready. And it wasn't until 1944 that the follow-on forces were able then to behave like a professional army. And even then, it was tough going.
So even if NATO were able to short-circuit that time between first echelon force spent, second echelon force capable to fight, on combined arms NATO maneuverist doctrine. And the way you short circuit that is by NATO members reinvigorating their strategic reserves and the sort of having that capacity to reactivate people like Hamish and me, God help the army, in order to sort of get back out there and fight, remembering the things we knew previously. There's still the reality of what industry can supply. And what's really interesting when you look at wars of national survival like the Second World War, the sort of technologies that you finish the war with, the mass that you finish the war with, is as much the stuff that you can manufacture quickly, easily at scale with the raw materials you've got access to, as it is any reflection in advances of technology. And I think, Hamish, that's what's really interesting about the way that the war in Ukraine has evolved, because for a combination of reasons, we're now seeing dumb bombs being used in Ukraine. Now, that's partly because they are the things that Russia has still got in its stockpiles, but it's also because in an incredibly electronically denied environment, all the electronic countermeasures in the world still can't defeat gravity. And so you can see how a second echelon fight might be much less technologically enabled than the first echelon fight. And if that's the case, does the West surrender its advantage?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point. Let me before I approach that, let me just go back to your original question about, how would NATO fight Russia? I think it's really important that the listeners and viewers to this, understand that actually NATO fighting Russia is a very different prospect from Ukraine fighting Russia with NATO support. I think, everybody would agree and know that NATO's combined arms capability with the Americans should be, an overwhelming force against the Russians. And, without going into the concept of operations, how we'd fight it, the Russians at the moment are running very, very hot, despite the fact, as you say, industrially, they are producing stuff at a really impressive rate. But their first echelon force has gone. They are probably, they would probably find it virtually impossible to fight on two fronts. But where you look at NATO and all the exercises that I'm sure that you've been to see up in Northern Europe with the Finns and the Swedes, also now part of NATO, the Germans, the French, ourselves, actually the force that we could mass for a first echelon attack on Russia, I think, stand fast the whole nuclear issue, which I don't think is a big issue, would be overwhelming. And that is why I have been frustrated that some of our politicians hitherto, not just in this country and elsewhere, have absolutely ruled out NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine. Because I think, Putin, for all his idiosyncrasies and tyrannic activity, knows that NATO would overwhelm Russia. So I think that is a really important thing for people to understand, because I know everybody's really worried about what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. But as you say, the second echelon force is getting less technical. And it sort of goes back to my opening statement that, we must not be over-seduced by technology, because all wars in the end seem to come back to a attritional type warfare. And he who can get the most tanks and manpower to keep coming generally prevails. So yeah, it's nothing new, just stuff we've forgotten. But I think ultimately, and I'd be very interested to hear Mike's view on this, I think NATO as a conventional military force is a completely different proposition fighting Russia than Ukraine would be on its own.
Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Hamish, I'm sure is quite right that NATO, by its nature, trains in combined arms operations, and of course, we know from the inside it always feels a bit scratchy, but actually from the outside it looks pretty impressive. And take NATO air power. NATO air forces always operate in a CAOC, combined operational center. They always do that. NATO pilots get hundreds of hours a year in their cockpits, more than twice as much as Russian pilots normally get. And the Russian Air Force doesn't fight in anything like, or doesn't train in anything like a combined arms way. They don't operate in chaos. They operate as a very old-fashioned sort of Air Force. And I think that's the point. If in any direct clash between NATO and Russian forces, NATO forces would be overwhelmingly superior as long as they don't run out of ammunition and as long as they don't run out of people in the first few days, as long as the forces are big enough and are sustained enough. So it's almost no contest. But that doesn't help the political problem that nobody wants a Russia-NATO direct conflict. But the Russians are pushing. They're pushing right up to the line, and they're trying to put the frighteners on us. With all of the things that they say, and they're succeeding in some respects. I mean, Putin has really got the frighteners on a lot of German politicians, talking about nuclear and talking about the prospect of escalation. Doesn't frighten us in Britain for all sorts of reasons, but my goodness, it frightens the Germans, and that's a worry, to be honest, a real worry.
And that's the really dangerous thing. We speak very confidently about how overwhelmingly superior the NATO forces on land, sea, and air would be for the Russian Army, Navy, Air Force. But of course, the catastrophic defeat of Russia conventionally, quickly, just brings the nuclear tripwire ever nearer. And so there's no easy answer. One of the things I've been struck by, though, over the last few years is a lot of the US-led exercises have evolved from using a Russian pacing threat around a Euro-Atlantic geography to being around a Chinese pacing threat and an Indo-Pacific geography. And I think that leads to some really interesting challenges for policymakers, because we've just talked for 10, 15 minutes about a continental battle in the Euro-Atlantic, supported by overwhelming air power and with sea lines of communication kept open through an overwhelming naval presence in the North Atlantic. The Pacific is an entirely different geography. And even before you get into what the PLA, the Chinese Army, Navy, Air Force have in their inventory, the simple challenge of transoceanic theatre entry across the Pacific is in itself hugely demanding. So do we end up in a situation where European powers within NATO need to focus on the continental demands of the Euro-Atlantic fight, but that the US increasingly will equip itself for that transoceanic fight into the second island chain and then onwards towards China? Or can we afford for there to be that sort of divergence in force design and sophistication between the US and its closest allies here in Europe?
Well, I think that's a really important dilemma that you point to. And I mean, just before we leave the Euro-Atlantic area, I mean, you will have seen this at first hand as a minister, but I think it's worth repeating for people out there. NATO does not have any plans and never has had any plans to attack Russia. Doesn't have any. I mean, the Russians always believe their word, that they don't exist. They simply do not exist. On paper, in discussions, NATO has never, ever planned to attack Russia or Russian territory. It's always been, how do we defend ourselves against incursions or challenges somewhere else? And that challenges somewhere else is now much bigger because of the China emergence than it ever was before. And so, of course, we're not planning to attack Russia. Of course, we're not. But the issue of having to deploy maybe in the Indo-Pacific in support of the United States and of our own interests in the Indo-Pacific is now bigger than it ever was before. And that's a real dilemma between, let's call it, a continental strategy and a global strategy. And to be honest, I think in Britain, the Navy has tended to pursue that maritime global strategy, and the Army has thought about and is now getting back to pursuing the continental strategy. And I suspect that future historians will say that Britain, in the first part of the 21st century, was caught in its old dilemma: continental or global strategy. But Europe as a whole has got to think about that global strategy more seriously than it did before, even while it's worrying about its own defense.
But look, Michael, friends in Congress and in the Pentagon are seized by exactly the same challenge. The US Marine Corps is attracting significant funding from Congress because it is Pacific focused, equipping itself for the island hopping that is needed in a Pacific campaign. And the US Army is finding that in order to justify its funding, it needs to make itself relevant in the Pacific theatre, not the Euro-Atlantic theatre. And it's quite an interesting challenge for the United States as in terms of how it wins funding for its military and how it then designs itself.
Yeah.
But I think that the idea that the UK, France, Germany, Poland all just equip themselves to secure the Euro-Atlantic and don't have to have the sort of capabilities that allow you to operate at enormous range in the Pacific theatre, it is for the birds. And so my every instinct, and Hamish, I'd be interested in your reflections, is that we have got to accept that the British Army needs to have an interoperability with the Australians and the Japanese. The Americans comes through NATO and therefore would just translate into the Pacific. We'll have an interoperability with those new partners and a relevance in the Pacific alongside the Navy and the Air Force. We can't just build an army that's really good on the plains of northern Poland.
I think there are 2 points here, and I agree. I mean, it is a huge dilemma. I think, first of all, our conventional defence in the European theatre and perhaps our focus elsewhere was one of the metrics that Putin looked at. When he invaded on the 24th of February 2022, he looked west and was not deterred. And I think we've got to think about that. But I also agree, the AUKUS and other treaties are absolutely key. And one of the great things, we might be very small in the British military, but we do have that flexibility. And I serve with the Australian Army as well. So, I know our standard operating procedures are all virtually the same. And people like the Australians and the New Zealanders, are extensively fighting on NATO concept of operations. So I think at the tactical level, it's relatively straightforward to be able to switch a force that's been fighting, mainland Europe to exactly that, out in the Far East and down in the South. I do think that people like the Australians need to take on more of the heavy lifting in this area, but we need that flexibility, and that's always been at the heart of the British military. We might be small, but we're very flexible, and we definitely punch above our weight. So in a perfect world, we will do both. But at the moment, I think the key thing, we must focus on Ukraine prevailing, but of course, at the same time, making sure that we can oppose the next threats that are likely to evolve, which may well be, as you say, in the Far East region.
So, it's clear in the way that the Chinese are developing their inventory that their whole war plan is around access denial to the United States at this point of the second island chain. So they're developing incredibly long-range, hypersonic precision systems that are designed to halt the US mid-Pacific. Incredibly expensive. Should the West be matching that and just and accepting that the early phase of the war is an incredibly expensive, very long-range engagement? Or is there is it time for the West to let China be the superpower spending huge amounts of money on the most exquisite technologies, and we should adopt the mindset of the insurgent and try and defeat their $1 million challenge with a $10 solution? Michael, is it inescapable that a fight with China is exquisite, or is there a way of doing this differently?
Yeah, it's an interesting balance between the political and the military, because politically, nobody can deny that China is going to be a major power for the rest of the century. This is the Asian century. It's not just all about China. It's all about India. The big four powers are America, China, India, and Russia. And they're big powers, all for different reasons, and they've all got their own strengths and weaknesses. And China is going to be a major power in the century. There's no point in the Americans trying to prevent that happening, but they've got to come to some sort of arrangement with China at some point when China has spent a lot more money on the military, when it's feeling the effect of its extremely high military expenditure, there will come a point probably in the 2030s when they will look for some sort of plateau. They will look for some sort of modus operandi with the United States. So there's a political element to this. And in that period, let's say for another 10 or 15 years, when the Americans have got to play it long, they've got to be strategically patient. They want to make sure that they can defend their key interests in the Western Pacific, which are, Taiwan, the Taiwan Straits, the independence and freedom of South Korea, and America's own relationships that come and go with Philippines, with Malaysia, with Vietnam. So preserving, rather than competing with China on every level, the Americans have got to think, I think, about their key interests for the next 10 or 15 years. And then they will look at another, let's say, another Nixon moment, another 1972 moment, when the Chinese feel that they don't want to carry on simply plowing money into military hardware and are looking for some sort of big arrangement. It won't come yet, but I think it will come at some time. So strategic patience would be my advice. And that means that the Europeans fighting our own struggling with our own issues in Europe have got to be prepared to support the United States in whichever way we can in the Indo-Pacific. So increasingly, European security will be about the Europeans supported by the United States. And Indo-Pacific security will be about the United States supported where we can by the Europeans. It's not either or. We've got to be prepared somehow to do both. And there's another integration of the two theaters, because if we are not successful in Europe, then insecurity in East Asia is far more likely.
Yes.
Whereas if we can defeat Putin's ambitions in Europe, then China will think very carefully about how it pursues its own ambitions in the Indo-Pacific and in East Asia. So, it's not as if we can ignore Europe and worry about the Chinese only. The fact is, how China perceives its security is partly dependent on the outcome of the war in Ukraine.
We touched on drones quite a bit up front. They surface almost immediately in any discussion of what's changed in the fight in Ukraine. But there is a danger that already people like us and the conferences that we attend all the time, people are already overstating what the drones are achieving. So definitely they are achieving huge amounts of surveillance, which makes it easier to reconnoiter and find your enemy. But Hamish, I'm sure you're not the only former tank commander, that feels hugely aggrieved at the idea that a hand grenade dropped from a drone is somehow destroying main battle tanks everywhere. My understanding is that most of the tanks that you see in those pictures and videos on Twitter have been defeated by a landmine or artillery or some other system first, and then the hand grenade is dropped through the hatch to dispense of the crew thereafter. So, these drones are not defeating main battle tanks routinely. When we've seen Houthis firing drones against US Navy and Royal Navy destroyers in the southern Red Sea, they've been dispensed of incredibly easily by these very sophisticated warships, albeit I think the economics of that fight, the US and the UK have been firing off $1 million missiles to defeat $10,000 drones, but nonetheless, the drones have not been a challenge to those destroyers. So how should we interpret the importance of drones to the modern fight? Because they are not the answer to everything, are they, Hamish?
Well, it's all about countermeasures. And I think two really important things. Don't forget that $1 million missile that we fired at a $2,000 or $20,000 drone is preventing it destroying a $500 million ship. So it's not a sort of binary metric, as it were. But, James, when you and I served, I find it rather amusing is probably the wrong word, but air defense was the sort of Cinderella arm. Whereas now my cloud punching friends, my air defenders, are the sort of the champions of the battlefield. So when I say countermeasures, that's what it is all about. When we say drones dropping a hand grenade into a tank, I mean, it's quite complex. You're right that it might be a mine, but of course, in Western tanks, we have armored charge bins. So if you drop a grenade into a Challenger, you might injure the crew, but you're not going to blow it up. Whereas a grenade into a Russian tank, because their ammunition is not guarded, that's where it blows up. But I think the drone thing is fascinating. And I just, I just wonder whether we are, I hope people, your successors in Whitehall, are really looking at this. When I was in doing intelligence in Afghanistan, we were using a couple of very expensive, very capable drones. You lose a £5 million drone and it's a big issue. But what we're seeing in Ukraine is thousands, if not millions, of $500 drones swamping the battlefield. Stand fast what Mike's saying about AI. That's the sort of next bit to it. But this is the current thing that is giving people a tactical advantage. But if you can, if your countermeasures will denude it, which surely they will, that's where you have got to go. I mean, interestingly, I'm currently writing a book on the development of tank warfare. At Cambrai, there was somebody like me with a ash plant going out the front checking the ground, and there was somebody in a balloon looking at targets. Now, virtually every Ukraine tank that I've spoken to has a drone checking the ground in front of it, and a drone at target end helping the indicate targets. So it's just a different way of doing things. I think we do need to look at the drone piece incredibly seriously. I mean, the Ukrainians have now developed drones that, now that they can attack 400 kilometers into Russia, taking out an Su-57 the other day, a $500 million Russian stealth fighter taken out by a couple of $1,000 drones. Now that's a different story. What's happened to the Russian air defense, which is why, again, I say, air defense is become such a absolutely key thing. But it's all about the evolution of warfare. And James, you'll know, no doubt, people like me were briefing you every other day on what was happening, what was changing, and what we needed. And this is just part of the evolution of warfare. And Michael will probably have a better view than me that, during a war like Ukraine, things move much more quickly than they do in peacetime.
So I want to finish, because we're very nearly out of time, on I'm afraid, a rather grim note. Hamish, you commanded the British Army's Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Regiment all the way through the wars in Iraq, the tensions in Syria, and now in Ukraine. The West has been very clear that the use of such weapons will bring with it very serious repercussions. And those threats have kept the taboo largely in place. But I'd be very interested very quickly in your thoughts, Michael, first, on whether in reality NATO and Western partners need to expect a CBRN threat in any fight that we might have with a peer adversary in the near future. Michael first.
Yeah, my sense is that it's a nearer threat than we used to think of it. The taboo has broken down, and it broke down, significantly in 2013 in Syria, after which there were over 200 chemical attacks in Syria. And so that taboo is not as strong as it was. And I think we have to expect that the greater weaponization of biological and chemical elements is likely to, if not take place, at least be a danger that we've got to take more seriously, even than when Hamish was dealing with it.
Hamish, I know you will want to evangelize over the need for it, but you have the experience to tell our viewers that this is an incredibly specialized skill set. You can't just operate in a chemical environment without any prior training. So what level of effort is required from NATO to recover the skills that the Army had during your day?
Well, I think there are a couple of things here. The thing about chemical weapons in particular is the psychological impact. I was the Peshmerga's chemical weapons advisor for 2 years in the fight with ISIS, and they threw chlorine at us at a regular basis. And the Peshmerga, the bravest men and women in the world, and they were terrified until they were trained and got the right kit to deal with it. So actually, it's the psychological impact that's massive. But if you know what to do and you have the right kit, actually, it's relatively easy to make it, a much lesser threat. At the moment, some people might be aware, and if they're not, they might want to read my columns in the Telegraph over the last couple of weeks, because we've been doing an investigation into Ukraine. People will be astounded to hear that we've recorded over 1,000 uses of chemical weapons on the front line in Ukraine since Christmas. It is a huge issue. Now, The chemical they're using is CS gas, right control agent. Most people, and Putin is saying it's not a chemical weapon, you use it all the time to quell riots in Europe. Well, actually, as far as the Chemical Weapons Convention, it is. I was only speaking to somebody yesterday who both in the morning and afternoon, their unit got hit with CS gas. Now, the issue with CS gas, if you don't have a gas mask, it's really unpleasant. In fact, you've got to get out of the way. So in First World War fashion, thinking back to April 1915, when the Germans first used chlorine and our troops had no gas masks, everybody got out of the trench and the Germans shot them. That's happening exactly the same on the front line in Ukraine.
Hamish, thank you. One is left with a sense of fear, really, at just how complex the operating environment is, because all of the technologies of a century ago are still there, still relevant, still deadly, still having an effect. And then all of these new technologies emerging on top. And in the course of our conversation, we've not even spoken about the challenge from cyberspace or space or disinformation or whatever else. Hamish, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. It's all we've got time for. This is Superpowers, the future of global security on Times Radio. For the latest in geopolitics and future episodes of Superpowers, subscribe.